Hi everyone, welcome. This is a bin of mixed red worms, or at least that's what I refer to it as. Supposedly it's got a combination of red wigglers, European night crawlers, and Indian blue worms living in it. And whether or not that mix of worms is truly represented or not, and if it is, in what ratio, I have no clue. It's just the assumption that I have in terms of what this is, because these are worms that were given to me a few years ago. I think it's been a few years now, by a fellow vermicomposter, and the bag that they were sent to me in was a Uncle Jim's bag, making me assume that it's just the mix, the common mix of red worms that most people use, that is sold by that worm retailer. So one thing I definitely remember in this bin, almost every time we would come in here we would see springtails. And the springtails are these little itsy bitsy little white insects that you see moving around here and there. And I guess some of the worms that we're seeing out here on top, I would assume that because of their dark color, well, it's kind of hard to tell. Usually when you see the really dark colored worms, you assume that they are the Indian blue worms. But I think that the other visual clue to tell you that it's an Indian blue worm is that it doesn't have that. I mean, it has it, but it's hard to see that protruding, thicker part of their body. So that's just my guess, is that that's what we're seeing here, is a couple of the Indian blue worms. Maybe a mix of them and a couple other types of worms hanging out here on the top surface. Let's see what we could do about evicting these little guys off the top surface of this paper, and then we'll set the paper aside and get down to the business of feeding this bin. I can see a whole lot more springtails now that we're starting to pull back the paper. Look at all these little guys, they're everywhere. And lots of them too. Wow. Alright, let's get off there, baby. Let's just go ahead and set these top coverings aside and make our way down into the bin, see what's happening in here. It looks like we've got a number of top covering pieces of paper here. One of them also being this, our feeding zone indicator. It's just a coffee filter, but basically it's usually positioned right over the spot where we last fed, and that would be over here on this far end. So now it was 2 check-ins ago, or was it 3 check-ins ago? I think it was 2 check-ins ago that we actually moved the worms into this somewhat larger container. They were living in a smaller box, perhaps about this size. So they were upgraded to this somewhat larger container 2 check-ins ago. That was 23 days ago. And then there was a 10-day pause up until the last feeding that they got. And then that was 13 days ago. So that point in time when they were moved into this bin, they also received a sunflower, pretty good sized sunflower, which would have been somewhere right over here, positioned within this bedding material that came in here alongside the existing material that came in from where they used to live in the smaller container, plus some new material. And then we went ahead and we shoved everything aside and we added even more bedding last time. So we've been gradually working our way up to a pretty good size amount of bedding in this container. And I guess I'm just curious to see if they've actually started moving into this far end of the bin where the most recent feeding was added. I was suspicious about what I gave them last time as possibly being stuff that might not really get eaten very fast, because it was apple. For the most part it was apple. So here we can already see a chunk of the apple they got last time. Doesn't look like they made much of it so far. And there was also a few chunks of bread. I think it was some sort of like a gluten-free type bread. It was a roll that had some really bad mold growing on it. And look at the color of this thing. Whatever mold was growing on it has certainly made itself at home on that. And it was like, I think, perhaps 4 or 5 pieces of apple and maybe 4 pieces of, I think that broke the roll into 4 separate chunks. So here we got another chunk of this hard roll. Doesn't seem to be going anywhere, but it seems like the mold is definitely making itself at home on it. I'm just wondering if perhaps the material over on this far end is still just a little too dry for worms to want to be in it, although down here you could see a worm on the very bottom of the bin. So that means it's not completely inhospitable to worm traffic. Here's a little bit more of what they got last time, very moldy bread. And I kind of figured it would be something that the worms would be all over, but from touching it I could feel that it's sort of dry. So if it's dry, it's not going to really attract worm activity. So it kind of makes sense that they're not really taking a shine to it due to that reason. And the apple is its own thing. Apple somehow also tends to take a very, very long time before the worms can finally start taking advantage of it as a food source. It seems like the mold that was taking a foothold in the bread is also kind of growing on some of this top covering leafy material here too. So just curious if we're going to find any other worms besides that one we saw down at the very bottom there. Things do seem a little bit dry over here, so it's not too surprising that the number of worms we're seeing over on this far end is somewhat limited. I'm assuming that once we drop in today's feeding, which is a bunch of frozen pumpkin, the frozen pumpkin has a tendency to really emit a lot of moisture as it thaws out. So I'm thinking what we could probably do here is return all these things kind of the way we found them. And then if we place the pumpkin straight on top of that, it's going to start thawing out and releasing its moisture. And perhaps once a little bit more moisture starts making its way down onto this moldy bread, perhaps the worms will have an increased interest in coming to check the stuff out. So why don't we proceed with plopping in today's food, and then we can perhaps explore the rest of the bin a little bit and see how things are coming along over there. Now I've got kind of an unusual bedding here, a couple paper plates. I went to my mom's house the other night, or was it yesterday, last night? Took over a pizza pie, and we had pizza pie, and that's why you're seeing some tomato sauce here on these paper plates. And then the other thing I did was I took the pumpkin that she had left outside. We had 4 days of really cold weather, and as a result the pumpkin froze solid for 4 days, and then we entered a little spell of much more mild weather, much warmer weather, and now that pumpkin that had been frozen for 4 days straight started thawing out and becoming really mushy. So I grabbed all the pumpkin seeds from it so that I can bring them home and make some worm chow out of it at some point. And then I just stopped along the way on the way home and dropped the pumpkin itself off on the side of the road in a place where I know there's a lot of deer, thinking that perhaps the deer can make a meal of the pumpkin, since it was just pretty much too mushy and too gooey for me to want to bring home and process it this way. I figured let's just give it to some possibly hungry wildlife on the side of the road on the way home. So that to me seems like a pretty nice, generous feeding. And yeah, we didn't end up really placing it directly on top of the old foods. So whether or not it's going to be able to share its moisture with some of that somewhat dry bread that's over here next to it, I don't know, but perhaps if I cover up pretty thoroughly with plastic at the end over there, maybe the worms will take an interest. Here's another worm right here. And I'm thinking the worms are probably more about being in these other portions of the bin, perhaps not so much amongst the food that was given to them last time. But hopefully if we continue giving them stuff that they like on the far end, and if the moisture level in the system starts to build up a little bit, then maybe the worms will eventually move in. Perhaps just the rest of the bin is just so comfortable and cozy for them already the way it is that they don't really feel the need to explore the somewhat drier end of the bin. So now I guess we'll reuse some of those newspaper top coverings, but this piece of coffee filter here can certainly be used as bedding to go into the feeding area. And then we can replace the feeding zone indicator with this nice new one that we just bought in. So that's what we'll do. But you know what? I think just to make this coffee a little bit more interesting, I've got a nice fresh batch of worm chow that I created. Ooh, oh, that's quite a bit. The thing is full to the rim, and it's, I guess, has a tendency to want to just come flowing out. So I definitely gave them a pretty generous portion there. This is a mix of bird seed, and I put some neem seed meal in there. I put some cornstarch. I even have I have an old box of pancake mix. So some pancake mix got blended in there, and then everything got pulverized to make it into a nice powdery consistency. So hopefully it's something that the worms are going to enjoy. Well, I guess we'll see. You know, when we come back in here, we'll see how they did. I mean, last time we were in here, I ended up sprinkling this entire top section with pulverized birdseed, and I wonder if we might benefit from treating this top leafy covering here with some of this pulverized stuff, this worm chow mixture that I've got here. But before we go ahead and we spread that leafy material out across the top, why don't we explore really quick, number one, how this intermediate layer of stuff is coming along. This was the fresh bedding that we built up for them when we first moved them into this new container 23 days ago. And it does seem like in here they're starting to make themselves pretty much at home. The material's got a nice moisture level. And if I'm not mistaken, could this be parts of the sunflower? It probably is. All this, yeah. I can tell from the smell of it too. It's got this sort of distinct sunflowery smell. It definitely looks like the worms are enjoying it. They're all throughout the stuff, in and out of it. And it even looks like it's been worn down quite a bit. I mean, this thing was pretty good size. It was a nice size sunflower. It had no sunflower seeds in it. It was just a bare flower, possibly picked clean of all of its seeds by birds or something like that. So I wondered how much of it we would find. It did seem to me like in the past when I have fed sunflower to my worm bins, once it gets going, it goes pretty quick, and the worms just gobble it up, and it falls to shreds. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. Large chunks of it full of worms, kind of enjoying it. So that's cool. I've got a funny feeling by the time we come in here next time, we might not even see any remnants of the sunflower. So over on this end too, it looks like things are nice and damp, and the worms are pretty at home, hanging out in this stuff. So that's pretty cool. I guess the last thing to check is the old material that came over with them from their old container, which had gotten to the age of 112 days prior to us giving them all this extra new space to live in, and then 13 days ago getting even more. So I don't know what to expect over in this stuff. It definitely has a much, much higher moisture content to it. The stuff's nice and damp, and it looks like the worms are still hanging out in it. It's probably because I still see little bits of bedding and food scraps, stuff that the worms are still taking advantage of. And I guess possibly the other reason being that it's very moist, which is just something that the worms really enjoy. They like being in the moist stuff. I guess as do the springtails. It's so weird, you know. Springtails are just something I don't seem to see in most of my systems. Perhaps a little bit here and there, but in here it seems like they're out in force. There's just so many of them in here. The system definitely has lots of springtails. And the castings that these little guys are making over on this end is really nice stuff. Nice and loose, nice and flaky. Got a lot of moisture content to it, but it's not really muddy, so that's cool. So, all right. I believe we're more or less done here. I was just curious to see how these various stages of the bin's development are all progressing. There are fairly distinct sections, you know, with the oldest stuff that's been around for a long time, as well as this fairly new addition that came with the new container, and then the more recently added stuff, which was still kind of dry and possibly not quite as hospitable. And even with the apples being placed out there and that moldy bread, perhaps those things didn't even really pique the interest of the worms. But my guess is that that pumpkin that we just gave them, that might be a somewhat different story. We might see a little bit more activity over on that far end of the bin next time we come in here. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see what becomes of it. So I think kind of like the last time, I'm going to sprinkle some of this worm chow out across the top surface. I'll see if I could spread it out here a little bit and blend it in with these leaves. It seems like I put it in here pretty generously. This is kind of like what I did last time too with just the pulverized birdseed. I sprinkled it into the top covering of leaves that they got last time. And that too might, you know, sort of spur on a little bit of worm traffic. Maybe getting the worms to become interested in the material that's over on this side. So let's get to covering things up. Put the feeding zone indicator over here to show where we added the pumpkin. We can come back in with some of these top covering pieces of paper. Usually just put out here as a place for the worms to, you know, hang out on if they wish to do so. And it did seem like they were enjoying hanging out on this stuff when we first came in here. So just giving them back what they obviously enjoy. So I'm not quite sure how it was arranged. Something like this. That should work. And then back with these unusually arranged top coverings. I guess when they were in the smaller container, these two pieces of bubble wrap were sufficient to cover up the entire contents of the smaller container, and I just bought it over here with them. And then I bought in this extra piece of plastic to help cover the remainder of the bin, and it did seem like we had a pretty good thorough covering going all the way around from edge to edge, preventing any sort of moisture loss due to evaporation. And that's really what I'd like to try to accomplish over here on this newer end of the bin where things are a little bit dry. I'd really like for the existing moisture within the system to circulate beneath the plastic and hydrate all those drier materials and hopefully make it into a much more hospitable place for the worms, a place that they would want to go hang out and explore and hang out in and enjoy being in, you know. And that was the other reason we put this piece of cardboard here, which was just meant to sort of create a dark, cozy spot for them to hang out beneath it. And, well, I guess we'll see how they like it. Next time we come back in here, my hope is that the pumpkin will get a little bit more worm traffic, you know, moving over into the new end of the bin. Not that there's anything wrong with them hanging out in the old stuff, but still, I like the idea of them taking advantage of the entire space that they've been given. All right, everyone, that's it for our little check-in today with our mixed package of worms. 13 days since their last feeding, 135-day-old system at this point, doing really nice. Kind of fun to watch them slowly, gradually making their way into their newly expanded accommodations. All right, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.